Well, longtime CNN host Brian Stelter, the man with the funniest name of any show on television, Reliable Sources, is leaving the network. This comes after revelation that CNN is axing its Sunday show, Reliable Sources, which Stelter hosted for 9 years. The shift follows the revamping that new CNN CEO Chris Licht is implementing. Ryan, we have heard a lot of reporting, and I think we've seen this from Licht himself, who refuses to even be on Twitter because he thinks it's poisoned the media, that CNN is trying to go into the direction more of what it used to be, kind of the dry breaking news network. It was always, it sort of had the if it bleeds it leads reputation, yes, but it wasn't doing a lot of commentary and opinion. It was really doing a lot more foreign reporting and had the reputation of being kind of the straight news. It was between the Fox and the MSNBC lanes. It was somewhere in the middle. Licht seems to think that's better from a business perspective, and that it's better, just ethically from CNN's perspective. And it looks like his departure, that Stelter's departure from the network, is part and parcel of this effort. What do you make of Stelter, who has been one of the most visible personalities on this network, especially throughout the Trump era, leaving the network now?
Well, most visible, but certainly not most watched.
Yes.
It wasn't a show that was doing like bombshell ratings. I've always been confused about how people call Stelter like kind of left wing. I never kind of saw him as a fellow traveler. What was it about him? I mean, I think you're right that Licht or whoever is making these decisions does see this as part of the transformation of CNN back into what they hope to be a kind of credible middle down the road that can appeal to everybody kind of network. But I mean, I didn't watch him a lot, but was he really was he just kind of liberal, like kind of mainstream Democratic? Like how would you think about his kind of politics or like kind of philosophy of the world?
It's a really, I think, good question, because it's the same way that you would look at Don Lemon or Chris Cuomo and a lot of these figures in sort of establishment media, because it's like Andrea Mitchell, like even Stephanie Ruhle, like none of them are leftists. They are not Bernie people, but they do share, I think, culturally, probably agree with you on the full slate of issues, and they may even be further to the left of you on some sorts of like cultural questions when it comes to political correctness, when it comes to opposing the right, just sort of across the board. So it's not like you can't use the leftist label on them, certainly, but they're like neoliberal culture warriors, basically neoliberal cultural warriors, and that leads them to really bad coverage of the basic horse race R&D politics, because they're then unable, like Chris Cuomo once said, the pro-life position, and he, by the way, said that he is just about facts. Like this guy, he's out there and he says he just calls balls and strikes. He just once said the pro-life position is more about feelings and the pro-choice position is more about facts and science. And again, a lot of our viewers probably agree with that 100%. But whether or not that's a neutral stance on the pro-life versus pro-choice question, obviously it's not a neutral stance. So if you purport to be somebody who's neutral, but you think it is neutral because everybody who eats lunch with you in Midtown and on the Upper West Side shares your perspective, then your idea of what American politics looks like is completely skewed. So while you're not an economic leftist because you work for corporate media and that corporate tax rate keeps your salary at a decent spot, sure, but you share that sort of full slate of cultural, cultural radicalism is what I would call it, but cultural leftism at least, and it makes it really hard, I think, to cover the country in a fair way.
Well, so where does he go next? The last high-profile CNN anchor who departed wound up at News Nation, which is actually owned by the same company that now owns Rising. So where do you think Stelter winds up?
I could see him somewhere there, but I could also see him, I mean, his real product for CNN, other than Reliable Sources, was his nightly newsletter, the Reliable Sources newsletter. Newsletters are a really big deal right now. I could see him taking his newsletter, honestly, to somewhere like The Atlantic. I could see him taking his newsletter to somewhere like Vox Media. I could easily see that happening, and just being kind of a newsletter guy. And this is one of the things with Brian Stelter that I think was always a problem beyond even just these cultural biases, is he is so incredibly defensive of the media, and I think it's because it's very much like the perspective of somebody who is surrounded by other people in the media and sees everybody as ultimately a protagonist, and has a very, very, like, you would see him at sometimes kind of flirting with this idea that maybe the media is out of touch, and he would be willing to have those segments every once in a while, but it did not inform that broader perspective did not inform his coverage whatsoever. And I think he's probably also a really instructive example of how hard it is. After 2016, those like couple days after the election, I was like, if this doesn't wake the media up, if the host of Celebrity Apprentice beating the former Secretary of State in a presidential race doesn't wake the media up, I honestly don't think anything ever will. And there were those like few days after the election where everybody was really introspective, and Dean Bequette at the New York Times was saying, we need to do a better job, we don't get religion, et cetera, et cetera. And then it just went fully in the opposite direction, just started sprinting back in the opposite direction. So even when people become aware of these biases, because of the way the media works, it's almost impossible to correct them. And I think Stelter is an instructive case study in that problem.
Right, and the media ended up taking a different lesson from Trump's election, that they had to be kind of part of the resistance to Trump.
Right.
And that worked extremely well for CNN's ratings throughout the Trump administration. But being a resistance against an entity that's no longer there is bad for ratings. And so, as Trump predicted, and as everybody predicted, their ratings really collapsed after Trump left. And so I don't know how tenable it is to toggle back and forth between being resistance when some Trump-like or Trump force is in the White House, then go back to the middle when they're not, and then do they go back to resistance if Trump or another DeSantis element comes into the White House, or do they lose their credibility along the way, or credibility with the audience that they're pick up?
Right. No, that's a really good question, because CNN really developed that hardcore resistance audience that was a tiny slice of the pie. I mean, they were really competing with MSNBC during the Trump administration, because they decided that the best way for them to corner this market was to go full resistance. And then you can get the wine moms tuning in every single night for that handoff between Don Lemon and Chris Cuomo. And that is the bread and butter. And those people who think Brian Stelter is the guy that's at the front of this charge to handhold the public, to say the public can't be trusted. The media needs to tell them what the difference between an apple and a banana is, even though the media is telling you the opposite, that this banana is an apple. That's that famous CNN ad where they purported to be the network that could distinguish between facts and fiction with the bananas and apples analogy, which is hilarious. But that was not successful for them. It really it did not pan out on the network side to be successful. Now, a huge part of CNN's business is their website. It is one of the top traffic websites in the world. It is one of the top traffic news websites in the world, let alone websites in general. So when a lot of people think like CNN's failing, the network is doing really poorly. There's no question about that. Their website is a huge part of their business, and it's doing great. So how worried they are about the network, I mean, it's a big part of their brand, sure. But they really went all in on the resistance because they thought it would be good for business. It didn't turn out to be that way. Now they have someone in charge who understands that was completely wrong, and I think they're trying to do some brand rehabilitation. And I mean, listen, I don't think people should trust a lot of what comes out of CNN. I didn't think that before Donald Trump came along, and a lot of people on the right didn't either. But I do think that it could be successful. I think they would be more successful as a network if they went more into that direction of going to building back that reputation for being more neutral.
Or, which I think that's actually shot. I don't think anybody can do that anymore, because nobody's going to believe that you're being neutral. So I think what you have to do is something like Rising, Breaking Points, and places like that do, which is to have multiple different perspectives and just be open about what those perspectives are, and then people can decide, synthesize them, pick one or the other, and then decide for themselves. But I think the era of saying, I am kind of fair and balanced, I'm a neutral, down the middle relayer of reality and events, those days are gone, because nobody believes that. If the right hears that and they hear left wing, the left wing hears that and they think neoliberal. So you're just I don't know who's left that appeals to.
It's such an interesting transition in media right now, because I think there are a lot of people who grew up with like Walter Cronkite on the TV who actually still really believe in that model, because it did seem to work for a while, and who have seen people pull it off and in high profile positions and do crave that. But I think younger people, like people who tune into this show, are exactly like you said. And so that's where I think this is sort of a phasing out. Even cable news, like streaming beat cable. This is big news this week also. Streaming finally surpassed cable in, I think, one study in terms of hours viewed per week, what people are watching the most. And so media, and especially cable news networks, are in a huge transition phase as people age out of demographics and people age into demographics. And CNN, when they tried to launch CNN Plus, that's what they were really trying to do. Peacock is doing it for NBC News, and they're trying to get into that market. So I think what we're watching right now, we're sort of in the middle. We're in the trees, but when you zoom out and you see the forest for the trees, I think that's really what's happening.
Yep, I think that's right.
Well, we'll be back with more Rising right after this.